You know, when you look out at a quiet, empty field in the European countryside, have you ever wondered what was there before? Well, it turns out that beneath all that grass, there's often a ghost story, a story of collapse. So let's dig in and figure out why thousands of medieval villages just disappeared. And I'm not exaggerating. That number is just for England alone. Over 3,000 documented deserted villages. Now, if you zoom out and look at all of Europe, you're talking about tens of thousands of these places. Settlements that were once full of life, and then they just weren't. So the big question is, where did they all go? Now, it's really tempting to point to one big, obvious villain, right? Like the Black Death or some huge war. But the real story is actually so much more interesting. It's about a deep systemic failure that was baked right into the very DNA of medieval life. Okay, so to really get this, you first have to understand what fueled the entire medieval world. The village, for all intents and purposes, was basically a machine. And it was a machine designed for one single thing: producing calories. And almost all of those calories came from grain. A whopping 80% of every single calorie people ate came from cereal crops like wheat or rye. They didn't have potatoes yet, or a bunch of other options we take for granted. What this means is that there was absolutely no plan B. A bad grain harvest wasn't just a financial problem, it was a full-blown existential crisis. This total reliance has a name. It's called hyper-specialization. And it's a double-edged sword. As long as everything is perfect, the weather's great, the soil's cooperating, the system is incredibly efficient. But the second something goes wrong with that one single resource, the whole thing becomes catastrophically fragile. One failed crop, and the countdown to extinction had literally begun. And, well, that something wrong was just around the corner. See, for about 300 years, Europe had been enjoying this amazing streak of warm, stable weather. But that party was about to come to a screeching halt. The world was about to get a whole lot colder. You can see the shift so clearly on this timeline. During what we call the medieval warm period, everything was booming. The population grew, and villages started expanding onto land that was frankly not that great for farming. But then, right around the year 13, the climate just flipped. The Little Ice Age kicked in, and with it came colder temperatures, shorter growing seasons, and completely unpredictable weather. That pushed this fragile system to its absolute breaking point. Now, for the people actually living through this, it wasn't some abstract climate data point. It was an absolute nightmare. The Great Famine of 1315, for example, was sparked by a year where the rain just never stopped. Imagine that. Your crops are rotting in the fields. You can't dry hay to feed your animals. And you can't even produce salt to preserve meat because the mines are all flooded. And this quote just nails it. The highly specialized, really rigid village system was like this beautiful, delicate glass structure. It worked perfectly when the weather was calm, but it was completely unable to handle the shock when the environment suddenly started throwing stones. It just wasn't built to adapt. It was built to shatter. So you might be thinking, okay, but why didn't they just save up grain for a rainy day? You know, have a surplus. Well, the answer to that lies in something called the feudal squeeze. A system pretty much perfectly designed to extract every last bit of value, leaving the villagers with absolutely nothing to fall back on. It was like a triple whammy of extraction. First, the church took a flat 10% of everything you produced. That's the tithe. Then your local lord would charge you fees for basically existing. You had to pay to use his mill, his oven, even to get married. And then on top of all that, the king would send his tax collectors around to bleed you dry for his latest war. There was just no escape. What this all meant was that the margin for error was razor thin, so when a bad harvest did hit, the taxes were still due. This forced villagers into a devastating choice. They had to eat the very seeds they needed to plant for next year's crop. It was a predatory cycle that pushed all the risk, all of it, down to the people at the very bottom. So the system is already cracking. You got climate change and crushing taxes. And then came the final blow, the Black Death. But here's the crucial part. The plague didn't actually kill the village system directly. Instead, what it did was spark a massive economic shift that basically made the old way of life obsolete. The whole economy got turned on its head. Before the plague, there were tons of people, so labor was cheap, and growing grain made a lot of sense and a lot of profit for the lords. But after half the population died, everything flipped. The surviving peasants could demand way higher wages, making labor super expensive. And all of a sudden, farming grain just wasn't the best way to make a buck. You know what was? Wool. And this is what led to the enclosures. It was cold, hard economics. Why would a lord pay dozens of expensive peasants to farm grain when he could manage a huge pasture with just one shepherd and a couple of dogs? So they began to forcibly evict entire villages, literally tearing down people's homes to make way for more profitable sheep. The village didn't just fade away. In many cases, it was actively killed for profit. So as we pull all these threads together, what can we really learn from these ghost villages? Because their story isn't just something that happened a long time ago. It's a really powerful warning about how complex systems, any complex system, can fail. Ultimately, it was never just one thing. It was this cascade of failures all hitting at once. They had no crop diversity, which made them vulnerable. Then a changing climate came along and exposed that vulnerability. A predatory political system stole any safety net they might have had. And finally, the whole system was just too rigid to adapt when the economy changed right under their feet. This slide, I think, really brings the problem into the modern world. They were in effect running a just-in-time economy. They had no inventory, no buffer, no backup plan. It's a model that always prioritizes short-term efficiency over long-term resilience. And as they found out the hard way, that can be a truly fatal trade-off. And that really leaves us with this final thought. It doesn't matter if it's a medieval village or a modern supply chain. Any system that ignores its environment, and that could be the climate, the economy, or the social fabric, is a system that is just waiting to collapse. The stories of these lost villages aren't just echoes from the past. They're timeless, powerful lessons written right there in the dirt.
Like and subscribe.